welcome everyone into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, June 25th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Deion. He had an interesting conversation with Joel Klatt, where they unpacked a ton of stuff. His relationship with Nick Saban, the way he's going about building his roster, his future at Colorado, which is a big question mark about him. So we'll get into all of that and break down all of the comments that he made. Then we'll get into roster building overall. Obviously, Deion is one side of the spectrum going all the way into the portal, but there's the other side of the spectrum going all the way into high school like Clemson is. So we'll figure out kind of which side is better, which side is the way to go, and how that could possibly change over the next couple of years. So that'll definitely be a very interesting thing to follow over the next couple of years. Then we'll get into kind of an interesting segment. I feel like every single year in college football, we have a certain group of people in every conference that decides the conference, whether it's quarterbacks or head coaches or offensive coordinators sometimes. There's tons of people that go into winning a conference, but it feels like one group in particular tends to separate themselves. And I kind of want to break down which group I think defines each big conference this year. Then we'll get into Heisman talk. We did this yesterday with the SEC. We're going to go over to the Big Ten and knock out them today as well. Then we'll get into a Top 10 Tuesday, and this one is going to be controversial. The one last week I felt like was going to be very controversial with the atmospheres. This one might be more so. I'm doing the best rivalries in college football as I see it. I'll do a top 10 list, and it is not an easy list to make, so give me a little bit of leeway, I hope. But at the end of the day, very, very fun list to make. But before we start, I do want to remind you all we get tons of comments and questions throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. But I can also see the chats on the side, so if you want to leave anything in there, more than welcome to do that as well. But if you do want to leave a tip and donation, gsmcpodcast.net is that website. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about Deion Sanders, because he had a very, very interesting conversation with Joel Klatt. As we've talked about on here, I feel like we've broke down a number of different things that have been said in these interviews, but Joel Klatt is making his way around the country, and he's talking to a bunch of different big-time head coaches. We talked about Steve Sarkisian. We've talked about Sherrone Moore in the past when he talked to him, but this time around, it was Coach Sanders, it was Deion, and it was a very, very interesting conversation. They unpacked just so many different things, from his relationship to Nick Saban, to his future at Colorado, to just what happened last season and what he learned about himself. And that's kind of where I want to start here, because I think there is, obviously, last year did not go the way that Deion expected it to go. He's a very confident guy. He came into that season thinking they were going to do really big-time things, and it didn't necessarily work out that way. They started 3-0 with a win over TCU, who was just coming off a national title win. They went on, beat Nebraska fairly comfortably. That was a closer game than the scoreboard showed, but at the end of the day, won that game, barely beat a really interesting Colorado State team, which is another team to watch this upcoming season, frankly. But then things kind of went awry. They got dominated by Oregon. They got dominated by I'm blanking on the team that they played next. It might have just been USC, so they didn't get dominated there. But there were a number of games throughout the end of the season where they didn't have that extra thing, whatever that is. Dominance on the offensive and defensive line was obviously a huge hole. That extra oomph to say, we're going to win this game where it's really close, one possession, and that's really where they lost the majority of their games. There were 5 losses on their schedule that were 7 points or less. So it really gives you an idea of kind of how close this team was, but also where the holes are. They're not necessarily easy to patch by any means. The offensive and defensive line are comfortably the hardest positions on a roster to rebuild, because they got to work together, and it's really, really tough to do that, especially walking into a conference that it's not going to be quite as physical as the SEC or the Big Ten, but there's plenty of teams in the Big 12 that are plenty capable of pushing some guys around. But also, he said he learned a lot. He said he knew that he had to go after the trenches. He knew that they had to do some different things to compete at a high level, and through the portal, he did a lot of those things. Obviously, we don't know what that'll look like on the field, but he added a lot of really, really talented players, especially edge rushers and offensive linemen that will definitely be starters and big-time players for Colorado this upcoming season. The other thing he talked about is Joe Klatt in the past, and probably the past 2 weeks. I think he was on Colin Cowherd's show when he said this, but he said that he thinks Colorado can compete for a Big 12 title and possibly make it to the playoff. Deion obviously agreed because that's something that he had promised before the season started. That's what he expects to happen. And that's part of what makes him kind of who he is, right? That confidence, that unwavering confidence is a pretty special thing, to be totally honest with you. So I've talked about this a lot on here before. I don't think this is a team that can currently win the Big 12, at least this year. I think there's too many quality teams ahead of them. I think there's teams that are really solid at the positions that they're not so solid at. And I think it's going to be just a couple of matchups where they just get overpowered and just get beat. So it's not to say that they can't win this conference. Obviously, with the 5-1 possession games last year, you're always going to have a shot to flip a couple of things around, get a couple of different, bounce a ball type plays, and make your way up that win total. And I think that's what they will do this season. But I think it'll be a little bit more modest than some people are suggesting. I think they could get to 8 wins. I think they could get to maybe even 9, possibly. But the way I'm looking at it right now, they're probably a 7-5, maybe an 8-4 team. At least that's the way that I look at it. If the offensive line is very much improved, then that conversation gets a little bit different. I'm just a little bit more skeptical of what the offensive line is going to look like. And then he talked about a little bit about kind of his mission at Colorado and what he wants to be at Colorado. One of the big things that I took away, one of the comments that he made, they were talking about the book that he's most recently written, and in the book he says, you will remember me as, the guy that played in the NFL and the MLB, the guy that played in a World Series game and the Super Bowl in the same, all this incredible stuff that is in his past. But he says you will remember in the future as Coach Prime. That's the way that he wants to be remembered around the football landscape, and there's a real chance for that to happen. The thing is, that could happen for the worse or it could happen for the better, right? The next couple of years could be a little bit disastrous up there at Colorado, and he could leave on kind of some bad terms. Some things could go wrong, and we remember Coach Sanders, but it's not necessarily the Coach Sanders that he wants us to remember. Now, obviously, that could go the entirely opposite direction. And he also kind of talked about the desire for him to put his players first and to kind of give them, whatever they need to be successful, and for them to walk out of the doors, better than they walked in, whatever that looks like for them. And I think this is something that there tends to be somewhat of a disconnect between the public about Deion and the way that he views his players and the people in that program or the people around that program and the way that he views his players. I can say with absolute confidence he cares about his players. I can say with absolute confidence that he wants those guys to succeed on and off the field. Now, he is a little bit more intense. That's just the way that he is. He is a professional football player that is back down in the college ranks, and these guys are professional athletes. It's one of those harsh realities that college athletes in general, but especially college football athletes, are going to have to get used to, where when you ask to be paid and you want to get NIL money and possible revenue sharing and all of these different things that are happening, you're going to be treated like professional athletes. And that comes with, being a little bit more blunt between the head coach and the players, and, maybe asking you to leave a program that you would absolutely love to be at, but you're not good enough to play at. And all of that is obviously really, really tough for the players to deal with. And it's not necessarily what we want in this sport, but you can't necessarily ask to be professional athletes and then get mad when you're treated like professional athletes, is I guess the point that I'm trying to make. So I understand that everyone is very, very divided on the way that Deion handles things, and frankly, I am too. I don't necessarily love all of the different things that he's done since he showed up. I didn't necessarily love the "I'm bringing my Louis with me" type of comment, but the reality is some of that is just what college football is at this point. It is a professional sport, and these kids are going to get treated a little bit more like professionals. But The final point he made and the final thing I want to touch on is first just his confidence in what he's doing, and then kind of his plan for the future at Colorado. And the biggest thing is obviously the roster building. When you talk about Colorado, it always starts with the transfer portal. We're always wondering, what is this team going to look like next year, and how many new players are going to come in. I mean, he essentially turned over the entirety of the roster in 2 years. He added, I think, 84 different transfer guys over the last 2 years, and that's almost an entire roster. So it's just incredible what he's been able to do through the portal, but the question is, does that work? Is that sustainable? Is that a winning way of going about business? And he said time and again, he fully believes that that's the case. And one of the reasons that I'm a little bit more on board, I suppose, with the way that he's thinking than I was before is the coaching staff he has is almost entirely, not entirely, but a lot of NFL guys. Over 100 years of NFL coaching experience on that staff. And that gives you a little bit more of ability to do this type of roster construction where you're bringing in new guys every single year, and there is a little bit of that free agency type vibe. Now, it's a little bit different at the NFL level, but at the end of the day, NFL coaches are a little bit more equipped to make those relationships a little bit faster and get to developing these guys a little bit faster. Now, the big difference is you're not getting that finished product that you usually get at the NFL level, but you're still getting a really good player, at least in most of these scenarios, and you have coaches that understand what it's like to have a guy thrown into the mix and you have to coach him right away. And then finally, he talked about the elephant in the room, which is his future at Colorado. Everyone wonders if, once Shadur leaves and once Shiloh leaves and Travis leaves, is he gone as well? He says he is absolutely staying. He wants to dominate there. He said that very, very confidently, and frankly, I believe him for the time being. And just for the time being, I'll be totally honest. I don't necessarily think that he has any immediate plans to find his way out. I don't think right now he's looking at this as a stepping stone job. The thing about that is, what happens if in 24 or 25 or 26 he has a big time year where they win 10 games, maybe win the conference, go to the playoff? There's going to be some people calling that are just going to be really, really hard to turn down. So I don't necessarily think he's lying by any means, but I do think circumstances will change, and I think he likely will not be at Colorado for too much longer. But at the end of the day, he's there right now, and I think he'll be there for at least the next couple of years. And the interesting thing here is, I think 2024 is going to be probably a 7 to 8 win season, and that'll be really, really good considering everything. Some people will say it's not so good, but it is really, really good if you're talking about the entire enchilada over there at Boulder. But the reality is, I think when I look at this team, 2026 is the year that I'm pointing at, because after 2024, you lose Shadur Sanders, you lose some of the guys that played such a huge part in building this team up right now. And then you have to replace your quarterback. You have to replace some of the offensive linemen you brought in, some of the defensive linemen. You have to replace a lot of stuff. But then 2026, you might have a little bit more stability. Jordan Seaton will be a junior at that point. I think that's a year where we could really see Colorado make some noise. But if it were, up to Deion, he would make noise immediately and every single year. And he has the chance to do that this year. There's no two ways about that. Every time I hear this guy talk, I get a little bit more confident in what he's brewing over there. Now, to be totally fair, I was very, very low on the confidence meter in terms of building a winning product out there. But at the end of the day, he knows what he wants. He has full confidence. He has a very clear vision. Will it work? I tend to say no, but who knows? He knows a lot more about football than I know, so I'm not necessarily one to bash the way that he's going about business. But I do want to talk about that in the next segment, because I think there's been some sentiment around college football that the transfer portal is the way to build a football team and it is the way to build a winner, and I don't necessarily fully agree, and I want to break down why I don't agree and why I think high school recruiting is still the way to build a winning program going forward, at least for the next little bit right after this, so stick with us.